Hello, everybody. Welcome to our panel today on regulators' role in the adoption of RegTech. I'm Richard Hyde. I am Professor of Law, Regulation and Governance at the University of Nottingham, and I'll be chairing the panel today. And what we're going to do is have kind of a chat between our two fantastic panelists about the regulator's role and what they can do in the adoption of RegTech. I'm joined by a transatlantic pairing to have this discussion. I've got Francesca Hopwood, who's head of RegTech and Advanced Analytics at the Financial Conduct Authority. And I've got Matthew Homer, who is the Executive Deputy Superintendent in the Research and Innovation Division at the New York State Department of Financial Services. And I'm sure they'll have some fantastic insights into this fascinating topic. Before we start the discussion between the two of them, I'd like to begin by asking Matt to introduce himself a little bit and also introduce the context in which the New York State Department of Financial Services are operating and the potential involvement of RegTech.
Great, thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Francesca. Yeah, let me just start by introducing the New York State Department of Financial Services. So we are the regulator for financial services in the state of New York. And of course, because so much of the world's financial services are in New York, it means we supervise quite a bit. Just to give you a sense, we have responsibility for the insurance market in the state of New York, for banks, and then all sorts of non-bank financial activity, including things like check cashers, student loan servicers, all sorts of small types of entities that you may have never heard of, totaling about $7 trillion in assets that we have responsibility for, including at most of the, or many of the foreign banks that operate in the United States and are based in New York. The other thing I just mentioned by way of context is that our mandate is only about 10 years old. So we were created after the last financial crisis and are the result of a merger between the insurance regulator and the banking regulator. And the advantage of having a mandate that's only 10 years old is that it's somewhat modern. Things still move quickly, and a lot can happen in 10 years. But in addition to sort of the core regulatory responsibilities you would expect a regulator to have, we also have a mandate related to economic development, job creation, competitiveness, and I think very relevant for this conversation, regulatory modernization. So we are really just at the beginning of our RegTech journey, and I think that for viewers here, I think on this panel, you have the opportunity to see, obviously the FCA is really really has been a leader in this space for a very long time, and in contrast, we're really at the beginning. And so I think to answer your question about how we're thinking about RegTech. Right now, our goals are very simple around RegTech, which is to automate as much as possible the collection of data and enable our examiners to engage in much more real-time supervision in order to really be able to focus on areas of greatest risk. So let me just pause there, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Now, Francesca, if I can ask you the same sort of question to outline the FCA and their approach and role in RegTech.
Thank you, Richard, and echoing Matt's words, delighted to be on the panel this afternoon, and very delighted to share the panel with Matt in particular. So the Financial Conduct Authority, I lead our RegTech and Advanced Analytics function. What does that mean in practice? And then I'll talk to you a little bit about kind of how that sort of sits as part of the wider FCA's kind of portfolio of activity. So my work is twofold, really. It's leading very much our external facing work on regulatory technology. As some of our delegates today might be aware, it's a space we have inhabited for about 5 or 6 years now. And I can talk a little bit about that sort of evolution as we go through this afternoon's discussion in a bit more detail. The other half of my shop is advanced analytics, and essentially that's supervisory technology, SupTech, and that's the younger sibling, if I may call it that, to our kind of portfolio of activity in the RegTech space, but actually very symbiotic. So in the early days, a lot of the activity that we started to develop in the advanced analytics space took their learnings and their inspiration from what we were seeing externally around RegTech. And our supervisory technology portfolio of activity is very much focused on helping us as a regulator achieve our objective. So whether that's driving greater efficiency, identifying harm, joining up the vast range of data that we ingest into the organisation. Because we are a regulator with a vast portfolio, we regulate upwards of 56,000 firms across retail and wholesale markets, and so our ability to understand and dig into the conduct and the prudential aspects of those firms in a large number of cases is paramount. And I think, you know, Matt spoke to the pace of change, harnessing advances in tech to enable us to at least keep pace with that, to discharge our duties more effectively and efficiently, is one part of my role. But as I said, the other part is very much focusing on pursuing and developing our agenda in the regulatory technology space.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether we can start a bit by picking up something that both of you have mentioned on pace of change. And so what do you think have been the drivers of the adoption of RegTech in your respective jurisdictions? And what do you think is going to drive future changes in RegTech adoption and use in those jurisdictions?
Shall I pick up on that one?
You can pick up on that one if you like.
Okay, so I mean, I think you're right. I think the pace of change has been profound. Interestingly, I think that, you know, regulatory technology is not a new thing. I mean, harnessing tech to enable better compliance is perhaps new, more of a focus. But I think what we have seen in that time is quite a lot of change. One of the drivers of that change is us and the regulatory community. You know, I think just over the time of the COVID pandemic, I think we have seen 7,000 changes in regulation globally. You know, and therefore that absolutely places a demand on firms to kind of get their arms around that, pass that, understand that it more effectively and efficiently, and automation clearly plays a role in that. So kind of we are driving that sort of expectation and demand, I think, as a community. I think also kind of the kind of the changes within the kind of on the demand side, and this is something I think, you know, we are increasingly wanting to understand in more detail. I think the history of us as of us operating in the regulatory technology space has been we've been quite focused on the supply side, understanding that, you know, what's going on within the ecosystem from that point of view. And I think increasingly understanding what is going on the demand side, how they can understand how service offerings from RegTech service offerings fit as part of their value chains is going to be an increasing focus for us. And I think in some respects, actually, COVID has been an opportunity for RegTech. I mentioned the kind of the acceleration around regulatory change, but I think what it has also demonstrated in a world where virtual has become normal, conversations like this in this format has become normal. Actually, what that has demonstrated is that there is a space for which firms to move to a much more automated and virtual way of operating, and actually the legacy and the footprint that RegTech has here, I think is to its advantage, and it is an opportunity that it could well play into. So a couple of observations from me.
I think that those are really insightful points. I would just kind of build on what Francesca said and say, I think for better or for worse, moments of crises tend to also be catalysts for action. And I think that the initial, I think Francesca's point is exactly right. RegTech has been around for a very long time, even if it wasn't called RegTech. But I think that the current kind of generation of RegTech, I think was really prompted by the financial reforms that came out of the last financial crisis, including Dodd-Frank here in the United States. And I think I do expect COVID to also be a similar accelerant for adoption and change in this space. I think just speaking from the regulatory perspective, New York was one of the first states. It was really the first state in the U.S. to be impacted in a major way. Fortunately, at least the health side of the crisis in New York State has stabilized. But I think that unlike previous crises, COVID-19 was really sudden, right? And so it's not like you had a period of time where, in theory, you could sort of get ready and kind of develop your capabilities. I mean, this is, at least for us in New York, it was really sudden and almost overnight, the impact. And so, I think from our perspective, I think the perspective of a regulator more generally, when that hit, right, there are all sorts of questions, right? Are our institutions prepared to weather the storm? What will this actually look like? How do we monitor the health of our institutions? How do we identify which institutions are at greatest risk so we can take proactive action to stabilize them? And unfortunately, I think that the answer to those questions really varies depending on the institution. So here in the United States, banks report data on a quarterly basis, but there's a time lag, right? So even if they report on a quarterly basis, you're still waiting 30 to 45 days to get the data. And then for other types of institutions, payments companies, non-bank lenders, the reporting can be annual or maybe even not as frequent as annually. And unfortunately, that's sort of a legacy. Those sort of legacy data, reporting frameworks don't work well in a moment of crisis when you need data immediately. And I think that's going to be a big, I hope anyway, I think it will be for New York, and I think it probably will be for other regulators, a real motivator for investing in our data capabilities and architecture. One of the things, for example, we're kind of moving forward, I'd say, on two prongs. One is that we've been developing what I sort of refer to as a dipstick solution. I don't know if that is the same term used in other places, but it's what you put in the car to check the oil, and like what's a very sort of quick instrument we can use to collect data on an ad hoc basis. So that's something that we've been focused on building, but then also starting to look at kind of the more underlying data architecture as well to build that out for the long run.
Thank you very much for that. I wonder whether Francesca would like to kind of build on that and talk about the kind of regulator's role in improving perhaps the data architecture or helping with improve the data architecture, or what the sort of barriers presented to RegTech and also supervisory technologies by the kind of data issues that Matt identified.
Yes, it's an issue very close to my heart, Richard. What would I observe? So I think I'd like to kind of focus on two examples. I think you've touched across RegTech and SupTech. So both of those in my world are very dear to me. But on the RegTech side, I think if I could kind of take it as sort of us back a little bit. And one of the things that we do as a department is as some of your delegates may know, is we deliver tech sprints. And tech sprints are a way of kind of catalyzing, convening, bringing multidisciplinary groups together across financial services ecosystem, across RegTech, to really go after those kind of wicked problems that we all know and probably love to hate to love. And one of those is has been around regulatory reporting. And exactly to kind of Matt's points, how can you pull data, with greater accuracy in real time, to really understand, at points need. So you get the granularity, you're able to kind of then, really understand what's going on. I think, clearly, for a lot of us, COVID has crystallized that acutely, but this was something we were looking at, back in 2016, 2017 with our machine readable and executable tech sprints. I hasten to add, they were more like marathons. I think they were, a week or so long. So I think tech sprint's a bit of a misnomer. But what I would say from that is what we have really been looking at is, okay, out of that spun proof of concepts that we worked on with our regulatory colleagues at the Bank of England, with a clutch of firms as well, to really understand, okay, in laboratory conditions, what might you need to do to build out a proof of concept that could test the feasibility, the viability of that kind of model. And it's around reducing the cost of regulatory burden. It's about increasing accuracy and that pace of ingestion for us as a regulator, and thinking about that. And actually, as we've moved through that journey to really understand what do we and how do we bring that to life, clearly the moonshot, the money shot that we're going for is, machine readable and executable. But actually building back from that, a lot of what we have been learning when we have taken that out of laboratory and conditions and inspected it within the regulator is it speaks to absolutely the fundamentals of data dictionaries, data definitions, really getting your underpinning infrastructure right, investing in and having the conversations about what do you need to do to build out that end-to-end. And we've been looking at it through the lens of like end-to-end, live testing in different domain areas to really understand you kind of how do you need to bring that to fruition across, in our instance, an estate, and in Matt's as well, an estate that is highly complex. Lots of different types of firms, lots of different sectors, lots of different data requirements. And I think that marrying up, as you say, Richard, of the innovation and the art of the possible that tech is increasingly revealing and enabling with us, with that hard graft often of what do you need to do to kind of put in and build that business case and build that rationale for investing in that, in underpinning infrastructure, which sometimes is not as exciting and engaging as some of the big kind of innovative pieces, but absolutely need to go hand in hand.
Yeah, I would. Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, carry on. I was going to circle back on subtech, but no, Matt, I'll hand back over to you.
Well, I was just going to add a little bit to what you said. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the technology is just one component of it. I mean, in many ways, it's probably the easiest component of it, right? And I think that what Francesca is talking about with regard to kind of testing and experimentation is really so important, I think, for a number of reasons, including, I mean, if you're thinking about a regulator's adoption of some of this technology, or even getting a regulator familiar or aware of it, I think that testing is such an important culture change tool. If I'm being kind of direct about it, right, to get people comfortable with some of this technology, to help people understand how it can benefit their work. That is probably, I think, one of the most significant barriers to regulators. I'll just speak from kind of my own experiences. I think that getting your colleagues and everyone internally kind of supportive is not something that's totally obvious or visible from the outside, but it's a sort of a huge factor, perhaps the most important factor to creating change in these areas. And so being able to engage closely with companies and others to test and experiment is very important. And I just wanted to amplify what Francesca was saying there.
Francesca, do you want to come back on subtech, or shall I ask the question that that's quite an interesting question that's come up. So a member of the audience has asked us to specifically address the challenges of making and publishing regulatory rules that are machine readable to better enable innovation in RegTech. And I wondered whether either of you might have a comment on that particular question.
So is the question, what do we need to do to get there, or
Yes.
what do we think about it?
Well, both really. I suppose is it a goal, or should it be a goal? And B, if it is a goal, what do we need to do to get to that point?
So look, I mean, I think with the tech sprints that we did, the 2 tech sprints we did back in 2016, 2017, that was definitely something we were seeking to explore. You know, we wanted to see, you know, how changes in technology might enable the kind of adoption and the ability to execute on the ambition of machine readable and machine executable. I think that is, you know, to our minds, that is still something that we are absolutely focused on and want to go after. I think what we have seen is that when you take it out of, you know, as I call it, laboratory conditions, you know, when we were, you know, and all of this learning is publicly available. Go and have a look, you know, look on our websites. If we had show notes, I could send you the links. But you know, all our viability assessments, you know, the learning is there. You know, what we saw was that, you know, we were testing that against very, very specific areas of our handbook, of our rules, and, you know, getting a lot of learning about what was possible. But we've known that the next stage, and that's what we've been focusing on over the last year, is looking at kind of a live end-to-end test against 2 areas of relatively greenfield regulation. And what that has revealed, actually, and probably no surprises, but I think it's really important, is what you need to do from a regulator's perspective in terms of joining up that regulatory ecosystem around your policy colleagues, so those who are formulating the, you know, the rules, the guidance. What does that mean, and then how you execute against that as a supervisor? So what data do you need to execute against that? And then what does that mean in terms of the underpinning fundamentals of what do you need to build out in terms of the data, the core data enablement, you know, elements of that, which enables you to then know that you are, you know, as Matt said, gathering the right data at the right time, at the right level of granularity to give you that flexibility to ask those questions. That is all. That is also probably kind of, you know, fairly common sense, but I think it's, you know, the complexity of the systems, and often legacy systems, legacy collections that we're working in, means that there's quite a lot of unpacking to go for. So to answer the delegate's question, is it still an ambition? Yes, you know, because the prize is great, right? The prize is, you know, is phenomenal in terms of, I said, reducing regulatory burden, reducing cost, improving quality. Those are all things I think we want to strive for. What we need to do to get there, I think, as Matt said, the tech is kind of the easier bit. And I think what I would also reflect on is it's still nascent. You know, the ability to deploy that at scale and safely is still something that needs to be finessed and worked through, and we would expect that to happen over the next few years. We're taking that time to go, okay, how do we need to get our house in order to ensure that we can maximize that tech when it gets to that point of maturity.
Matt, I don't know if you've got anything on that, or if not.
No, I mean, I think, you know, I'll be very transparent and say it's not really sort of on our agenda right now. I mean, it's something that I agree is important, and I think we're kind of focused on the building blocks to help us get there. And, you know, I think that, but I do think it can be particularly, I think it is important. I think it'll be useful, particularly in kind of new areas that are, you know, like digitally native products or services. So like, rather than, you know, I think it's probably worth kind of looking at existing rules and regulations as well. But I think that, you know, starting in greenfield areas, you know, if I had to guess, if we were to kind of do something in this space, it'd probably be in a greenfield area, like in an area like AI or machine learning, derived underwriting models or something like that, right? Where you're kind of starting a little bit from scratch. But again, I think at least from my perspective, I mean, we're kind of focused right now on the building blocks at this stage.
Excellent. And I wonder whether I also pull up another question that's come up. So can RegTech lead to kind of a disaggregation of regulation and lead to it being more real time and more kind of focused rather than sort of standardized? And if so, how is the question? Bit broad, I think, but I wondered whether we had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any thought. I think it is an interesting question. I mean, if what I'm hearing is can we move toward a model where you don't actually need data standardization and you can kind of use other techniques? I don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, I think that it's important to kind of probably try both approaches. I think one thing I would say though that I think is sort of relevant to the conversation here is that the breadth of financial services is so broad that it's really important to consider how can RegTech and similar solutions benefit all parts of the financial system. I think we know that banks obviously have a huge incentive, I think, to adopt RegTech and improve their compliance through technology. But we know that a growing amount of financial services is not conducted through banks, right? We know that there are many types of financial institutions that are not banks. They're probably, in many instances, they're still regulated, but they're not regulated as banks. And so I think that it's important to think about how do we create an umbrella that will properly capture and give us a snapshot of the entirety of the risk that exists, right? And not a very granular, perfect sort of understanding of risk for only one sector. Because I think we know from experience that that just means that the next issue will arise somewhere else. And that's something I think a lot about, particularly sort of smaller institutions that may not have the same amount of resources to invest in some of these solutions. How do we help those non-bank institutions adopt better compliance technology?
Francesca, I wonder whether you had anything to say. If not, that leads nicely to another thought I kind of had, which is, and sort of chimes with one of the questions that we've got in, is how do we, or how do we ensure that regulatory technologies are accessible to a whole spectrum of regulated entities across your field of regulation, and how do we make sure that we're able to get the benefits of those regulatory technologies into the kind of smaller firms who may be less savvy and certainly have less ability to kind of develop their own regulatory technological solutions and implement them?
I think that's a very good question, and I think it's really important, and it's come up for us in a number of ways, and one of the things that I suppose I'd like to kind of reflect on a couple of examples is I mentioned our digital regulatory reporting project, and one of the things that we were very mindful of is that I'd mentioned we were working with a group of firms. They were the largest firms, and actually it was really important for us to think about, well, they are across the portfolio of firms that we regulate, they, in their size, they're the exception. There's a vast majority that are significantly smaller, and so therefore, if thinking about kind of any kind of practical operational change in the longer term, how do we engage the smaller firm population with that and really think that through? And so that's a very live issue for us. One of the other examples I wanted to kind of reflect on is I mentioned we do tech sprints, and one of the things that we have observed from tech sprints is they spin up proof of concepts. The teams who work on them across the week develop and ideate and develop propositions. And we observe those proof of concepts post event to see kind of what happens to them and where they go and what they do. And one of our observations, and it's actually something that I feel the pain of from the supervisory technology part of my world, is that it's actually really challenging to make that leap from proof of concept through to proof of value as a RegTech fan. And part of that, and I hope this goes to start to answer the question, is that actually what is really challenging for firms to do is to be able to show the value of their proof of concept at scale. And you need data to do that, but you also need an environment where you can bring the supply side and the demand side together. And the demand side can interrogate and test and explore and see what that proposition the offer and the value of that proposition and how it sits alongside or as part of their other systems and kind of along that chain. And I think that is, so one of the things that we, the insight that we have taken around that is, okay, what do we therefore need to do as a regulator? What's our role in creating an environment where RegTechs can test the value, but also demonstrate that value so that the demand side, whether that's big incumbents or smaller players, can then observe, interrogate, understand what that proposition looks like. We are piloting a digital sandbox. So some of your delegates might be aware of our regulatory sandbox, and we are piloting later in the autumn a digital sandbox. And the hypothesis that we are wanting to test with that is exactly that. What is needed, particularly for RegTechs, to make that jump from proof of concept through to proof of value. But also the other hypothesis is we think there needs to be a space, a marketplace, for want of a better expression, an observation platform for the demand side to come together and interrogate with the supply side what those opportunities, propositions look like, whether they are meeting the need, because we know that there is, I think, thousands of RegTech firms. One of the observations I would also offer is I think that they have it's an untapped potential. There's a lot more that they could do. And so one of the things that we have been thinking about as the FCA is what is our role to with a competition remit, with a consumer protection remit, to kind of advance that space.
Thank you. Matt, anything to add to that?
No, I think those comments were brilliant. I think I would just, I don't know. I think it's a very important question. I don't know I don't have an answer to the question. I have some thoughts though. But I think that it is a very important area to consider. I would say a few things. I think, one of the things that can be, I think regulators, I think that the tech sprint model is really a fantastic way of doing this, and the digital sandbox is, I think, very exciting as well. I would say, I think that there's an important role for regulators to play potentially in convening, right? Bringing companies together that for competition reasons may not otherwise come together, and it will only work, it can only happen, right, if it happens sort of under a regulator's purview. So I think that just that is very important. I think that I think that when we're talking about smaller institutions, I think the possibility of co-creating solutions with them, which I think is basically, a tech sprint is like a way of kickstarting that. I think that's probably also very important, and I think regulators again can catalyze that, even if it becomes something that industry then takes forward sort of on their own. Another thing that is a dynamic, at least here in the United States, is sometimes the bargaining power of these small institutions is not great, right? I mean, they're small, and there are, if you're looking at core processors, there are only really a few in the United States. And so I think that, the ability for any one company on its own to kind of, get their solution providers to provide the type of solutions they need is really limited. And so I think that, something needs to be done there. Again, I don't know what it is, but thinking about how do you improve kind of the bargaining power of some of these companies. And then, I mean, the final thing I'd mention, I think, is related to some of the other ones, but I think we should, in some of these spaces, we should be thinking about, RegTech or compliance utilities that could be, shared resources. And again, I think the regulators, it probably does need to be involved there to ensure that competition rules are not being, violated. But I think that, I think that's probably also an important way to address this issue for smaller companies.
Thank you very much. So we are coming towards the end of our time. We have one question, and I want to give Francesca a chance to have a little thought on the relationship between regulatory technology and supervisory technology, which we cut her off in her prime earlier on. The one further question is, do the panelists have thoughts on XBRL and the adoption of the XBRL standard and how it might facilitate the effort? Do we foresee it being something that's going to be more widely adopted and make a difference to regulatory technology development? If anyone's got any thoughts.
I'm going to kind of own that I cannot give a very technical and kind of rich answer on that, I'm afraid. What I would say is, kind of taking a step back from that, is traditionally we have been kind of agnostic in kind of sort of stating things that we are particularly in, placing bets. But I think what you might have seen from, particularly the AML and financial crime text from last year is that, by calling out particularly privacy enhancing technologies as something that we thought had the potential to further some of the kind of data sharing issues that were traditionally kind of challenges and barriers in the AML and financial crime space, we moved somewhat away from that tech agnostic position. So I think it's a really interesting question. I'm sorry to whomever asked it that I'm not able to give a very rich and specific answer to it. But I think as a regulator, what I have been able to kind of share a little bit is we recognize that our position needs to change as the environment around us changes, and where previously we had held back from having a particular view. I think particularly with as I said, with the AML and financial crime piece of last summer, we are starting to shift that position to kind of wanting to explore, I think is what I would say, wanting to explore the potential of some of the technologies that or capabilities that are coming through.
Excellent, thank you very much. Now, I don't know whether we should wrap up there, or whether Francesca would really like a minute on the relationship between supervisory technology and RegTech. But,
I'm glad my enthusiasm has come through, Richard. I'm glad my passion for RegTech and SupTech has come through. But no, I do not need to hold the floor on SupTech unless there is a burning question.
Well, maybe we should have, as you know, it is also one of my deep passions, the relationship between the two and how they work together. So we may have a chat about this at some other point. But I hope that you enjoyed that panel as much as I did. It was, I think, a fantastic insight into two of our most innovative and important regulators and how they are relating to and supporting the development of RegTech throughout their different regulatory estates. If I was in a room with you all, I'd say give everybody a round of applause. But I am presuming that you are, and I myself will give a small round of applause to both of our panelists, who I thought were absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much, and I will now hand over to our hosts to wrap up, and thank you very much for having me, for having us, and for really putting in some great questions and listening to the session. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, and thank Francesca and Matt for a really great discussion to wrap up day one. I think it's there was a lot of passion and excitement around RegTech, which hopefully is passed on to our attendees who are tuning in remotely. So that is the last session for today. Hope everyone enjoyed the first day of the summit. We've had over half of the 1,600 participants registered tuning live today, and we expect the rest to join us tomorrow. There's a lot of exciting discussions coming up, so don't miss out. But while this is the end of the content and the panels, our exhibitor rooms are still open, so do go check them out. Besides the top level and top-notch RegTech solutions, they're also offering free swag, free bottle of champagnes, and other perks. So don't miss out on that, and go check them out before you go for a well-deserved break for today. And I hope to see you all tomorrow. Take care and bye-bye.